US President Donald Trump opened another potential front in his trade war on Friday. His administration terminated India's designation as a developing nation. This means India would no longer be exempted from duties in exporting nearly 2,000 products to the US. Trump said, and I quote, that India has not assured the United States that it will provide equitable and reasonable access to its markets, and hence it was appropriate to terminate India's preferential treatment with effect from the 5th of June. India, of course, responded by saying that it was unfortunate that the US did not accept a resolution it has offered during the bilateral trade talks, but maintained that its trade discussions would be guided by its own development imperatives and concerns. What does this mean for the relationship between the two countries? To discuss that, we're joined by Raj Bhala. He's, of course, a Bloomberg Quint columnist, distinguished professor at Kansas University School of Law as well. Professor Bhala, thanks so much for taking the time out, and good evening to you. I think. Good evening to you. Yeah, no, I was going to ask you, from what little I've read over the weekend, it doesn't seem to be too big a dampener because the quantum of goods and therefore the duty benefits available weren't that big, and maybe some export incentives will do the trick. But what does this signal in of relations between India and US?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The total trade value of GSP-covered goods was about $5.7 billion in 2017, but the actual trade savings in terms of tariffs was only about $260 million. And indeed, the margin of preference, that is the difference between the average US MFN tariff and the zero duty under GSP, is quite small. And it's sometimes said that really GSP is an asset of diminishing value because of that small margin of preference. And I don't think a great nation like India was staking its future on forever, if I may say, milking the cow of the GSP. I'm smiling because I think this is one of the greatest opportunities that India has since its independence to distinguish itself from China and also to develop the strongest relationships with the United States that it has had since independence. And let me explain why. First of all, India's got some sectors that can really benefit from the Sino-American trade war. In an excellent October 2018 paper by the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade in Kolkata, the authors very cleverly identified the merchandise that is subject to the Section 301 tariffs that are coming out of China, and compared them to the Make in India merchandise that are, of course, not subject to those tariffs, and identified several key sectors, including, for example, iron and steel, aluminum, electrical machinery, railway and locomotives, aircraft, spacecraft, many areas in which India could prosper and benefit from the now 25% tariffs that have taken effect on Chinese goods. And then we all know the story also that Apple and Samsung will be making more smartphones in India and exporting them to the US. Whereas if Wave 4 tariffs go on against Chinese products, and I suspect they will sometime in the next few months, India will benefit from the smartphone exports to the U.S. But I think there's another piece of this too, where India can really distinguish itself. And again, this is the optimistic story, and that is India's willingness as a democracy to understand and accept its own shortcomings. Look at on the one hand at the rhetoric coming from the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army leaders this weekend in the Shangri-La in Singapore, compared to the rhetoric coming out of the new Indian government. India appreciates that it has higher MFN duties. It's got a market access problem. For example, its overall average tariff rate's about 13%, whereas the U.S. is 3.4%. That's something India can work on. India knows it needs more FTAs. India knows it can join in some sectoral agreements. But in contrast, the U.S. relationship with China is much more fraught with denial, and the U.S. would sometimes say deception from the Chinese side. I think this is just a great opportunity, substantively and stylistically, for India, again, to really show it is different.
So, Professor Bhala, I'm presuming you are sanguine about what's happened on Friday from the US side. It will not have a big impact. But the other thing is, what happens in the event of what is looking like a slowing GDP worldwide because of what the yields across the world are indicating. And if this trade war and the shape that it is taking with Donald Trump, I mean, the US-China issue is one thing, but Trump's comment on Mexico, they're refusing to meet eye to eye with the EU as well. If all of this brings down the world growth numbers, and what does a country like India or some of the other EMs do in such a scenario?
Well, I think take each one of those separately. I don't think that the U.S. is in the end, or at least anytime soon, going to impose tariffs on Mexican merchandise. Already, the U.S. agricultural and chamber community and the Chamber of Commerce have come out very strongly against such a move. Probably what you'll see the U.S. do is kick the can down the road. And what I mean by that is just as what the U.S. did with Europe and Japan on autos and auto parts under Section 232. Namely, the U.S. said, well, we will wait 6 more months before thinking about imposing tariffs because we feel there is sufficient progress being made in the bilateral Euro-American and Japanese-American trade negotiations. The U.S. is very likely to do that with the negotiations with Mexico. Mexico is going to be doing enough that the U.S. can say, well, we think there's enough progress here that we don't need to impose those tariffs. And of course, again, if it did, the pressure against it from the business and the farming community is enormous. Moreover, it would defeat the very campaign promise that the president would like to make. That is, I not only renegotiated a better NAFTA deal, but I got it through Congress.
Okay, so Professor Bhala, do you reckon in any sort that the world growth, which is already looking weak, whether or not the Mexico event happens or no is one thing altogether, and let's work with the presumption that the US won't do it, but the world growth, which is starting to look a bit anemic, would get pounded even more if the US-China issues do not see a resolution in the near term? It may not worsen too much from here, but it will not see a resolution.
Yeah, the forecast that I've seen that we probably all looked at in terms of a slowing of growth in China, 1.5, 1.6% GDP, a slowing of growth in the U.S. half or 0.6%, would have some knock-on effects. I don't want to minimize those, just like I don't want to minimize the tariff revenues that GSP producer exporters or importers have to pay when they lose GSP status. Every dollar matters. That's for sure. But I not being a professional econometric forecaster, what I have read is that even if we go to the full-blown wave 4 tariffs, the concern is, yes, a slowdown. How deep and how long that would be, that I can't say. But again, what India could plan for that worst case scenario of a significant slowdown by taking advantage of the opportunities it has through its a budding bilateral relationship with the U.S. But I'm sorry, I can't specifically tell you it's going to be 10% fall or 20% fall.
Okay, one last question, Professor Bhala. Do you think that post this salvo from the U.S., could the tariffs tariff or any kind of relationship between the U.S. and India take a turn for the worse? Not a relationship perspective, but more a rate or a tariffs perspective. Can there be more products that would on which some preferential treatments could be withdrawn from the U.S. side?
Well, the GSP list is pretty much the list that India has been enjoying, those roughly 1,900 articles of merchandise. I mean, the U.S. could impose soft non-tariff measures, additional inspections. We've seen that with the Food and Drug Administration and generic exports in years past. But in terms of straight tariffs, unless the U.S. were willing to violate its GATT Article 2 tariff binding commitments, levying higher tariffs on existing products from India outside of the loss of GSP, no, I don't see that.